First, this session is being recorded and will be used to inform post-event analysis and a strategic brief ahead of the India AI Impact Summit. Second, please feel free to start sending questions through the chat function at any point. We'll return to audience questions midway through the session and again towards the end. So, to open the session, we're very pleased to be joined by Isabella Wilkinson, Research Fellow with the Digital Society Program at Chatham House. Chatham House has been a close intellectual partner in thinking through how AI governance, safety, and geopolitics are evolving, particularly beyond headline debates in Washington and Beijing. Isabella will begin with some comments and some remarks and help to situate today's discussion within the broader policy landscape. So, Isabella, please.
Thank you so much, Al. I'm just going to share my screen. Now, as Al mentioned, I work at an international policy institute called Chatham House, where we've spent really the past year thinking about something that I think is in the front of many of our minds on this call today. What is sovereign AI, and what is possible with sovereign AI for middle powers or powers who might not have the resources and leverage of the US and China? And so I'm going to very quickly, before we turn to our expert speakers, take the opportunity to share some top lines from a year's worth of research. The top line for us, and what I really want you to take away from the next 5 minutes, is our core argument. Now, while low and middle income countries, some of which we'll discuss in today's call, some of which I think participants on the call are representing. Now, while they may be limited in resources and leverage, constraint is not paralysis. And there are 4 strategic routes that we map out that we encourage countries to think about in order to maximize their autonomy, very much as a conversation starter. So really excited to feed in some of these insights into the conversation today. Now, as part of this work, what we did is map out a diversity of rationales underlying the current very intense scale of investment into sovereign AI. Many of these themes will be incredibly familiar to our audience here today, our speakers and our participants, and I'm excited to seeing how they manifest differently and drive policymaking and policy objectives in the countries we have on this call. Most importantly, this research led us to an understanding or a definition of sovereign AI. We understand it as the ability to influence, develop, and deploy AI in line with national interests. There's flexibility there, and I'm really excited for the Q&A to see whether this tracks in your national contexts as well. Now, the background to this work is the sheer asymmetry of the global AI race. The US and China race ahead with other countries, including low and middle income countries, trailing relatively far behind. Now, the graph I've put on screen, which we've taken from epoch.ai, shows supercomputing capacity as of 2025. You can see the US at 75%, China at 15%, and the rest of the world at 10%. Now, of course, this extends beyond compute. The superpower dominance extends to masses of data, incredibly powerful frontier models, competitive talent. And what it leads us to is a recognition that full stack national ownership over AI capabilities is practically infeasible. Think about the state of geopolitical dynamics. Think about the state of interdependence and entanglement of the global AI value chain and the global AI supply chain. A degree of dependence is inevitable. Some of this dependence inevitably carries strategic risk, but dependencies across the AI stack, as Al kind of alluded to as an introduction, raise difficult policy puzzles for governments seeking to act in the public interest and maximize autonomy at different levels. What we call this puzzle is a kind of dependency negotiation. And we call for breaking down these dependency negotiations into foundational building blocks and enabling building blocks. Now, I don't have the time to go into each, but I'm interested to see how the countries we have here on the call today have excellence in some of these building blocks and have far to go in other of these building blocks, and how each seeks to curate meaningful choice over, say, the partnerships, the dependencies they're willing to accept, and the national capacity they want to invest in each of these categories. Now, it's no surprise to you that our paper and our work calls for negotiating this dependence at these multiple levels, understanding sovereign AI not just as one thing, but as something that effectively is multi-level and has different refracted dependencies throughout. This complex, multi-layered understanding leads us to four pathways, which I mentioned at the top of my presentation. I'll keep it incredibly brief here because I really want to hear from the experts on the call whether these are feasible and how they play out with the state of, again, geopolitical tension, but also thinking about where the technology is going to evolve in the next year. The first of these is specialization, well suited to middle powers with existing industrial strengths. You can achieve strategic influence by achieving dominance in a specific segment of the AI chain. Let's move now to alignment. The most strategically coherent pathway can actually be to choose deep technological dependence in exchange for guarantees, for example, access to powerful technology and security. Let's move now to pooling or sharing. Middle powers that view total alignment as unacceptable or unfeasible, and they lack the capacity for individual specialization, may prefer to pool resources like talent and compute, negotiate collectively. The final one is on hedging. Now, this is very well suited for middle powers with strong technical capacity, diversified economies, and a preference for strategic flexibility. Open source AI, which I know that we'll get into later in this talk, will play inevitably a key role in a country that might be interested in assembling a hybrid AI stack, a modular approach. What I'm going to do is leave it here and defer to Al and our expert speakers. But thank you so much for your time and interest, and very, very happy to return to some of these key themes in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Now, I should note that this is the second part of AI Safety Asia's Impact Dialogues Road to India AI Impact Summit 2026 series. And I encourage you to watch the video of that session, which we had the other night and the other day. And this dialogue that we had underscored that inclusive governance isn't just normatively desirable, it's technically and strategically necessary for effective global AI risk mitigation. Now, let me go to setting the frame for today's discussion. As governments prepare for the India AI Impact Summit, debates around AI safety and governance are entering a more decisive phase. Attention is shifting from high-level principles to practical questions of capability, sovereignty, and preparedness, especially for low and middle-income countries navigating AI adoption under conditions of geopolitical competition and constrained resources. Open source AI is often presented as a pathway to autonomy, but sovereignty does not reside in code alone. Dependencies can reappear across compute, data, platforms, standards, governance, capacity, and liability frameworks. So today we'll explore what we're calling the stack of sovereignty and what I describe as the sovereignty gap, the space between open code and actual control. We'll do this with a couple of rounds around the panel, followed by audience questions, and then a return to the panel for maybe a policy-focused round before closing again with the audience. Let me introduce our panel, and I will just do the top line titles. Please, you can find their bios online, but for the sake of time, I'll just introduce them by their current titles. So Dr. Nguyen Gang is head of Model Hub AI Singapore. Dr. Saeed Muntasir Mamun is Director General International Trade at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bangladesh. Akshay Mathur is Senior Director at the Asia Society Policy Institute, India. And Alex Krasodomski is Director, Digital Society Program at Chatham House, which is co-hosting this webinar. So let me start with you, Dr. Gui, Zhangang, if I might. Let me start. Open source AI is often described as democratizing capability, yet many so-called open models still depend on centralized compute, foreign cloud infrastructure, and non-local tooling. So from your experience, does open source AI meaningfully reduce dependence for middle income countries, or does it mostly shift where that dependence sits?
So, if I may, I'll start speaking now. Uh, that's a really good question. Something that we should all think about. Um, it's easy to it's easy to have like a very high level plan and think that I want to have, or rather, we should have a sovereign model. And to do that, we need an open source model, right? But it is true that in order to be able to use the model effectively to deploy it, you need compute resource. You need to be able to deploy it in a suitable infrastructure. You need to have the capabilities, the talent to be able to fine tune it further, to be able to maintain the model. So all of these are dependencies, right? Um, I would say that number one, it is possible to build such infrastructure and capabilities without having thousands of GPUs at hand, right? And the Sea Lion model is a great example of this, in the sense that we've managed to build a model that we think is quite capable for the sea region, the Southeast Asian region, without actually having to use the level of resources that, for example, like China's DeepSeek or OpenAI have had to use, right? And we've partly managed to do this because, we work with what we have, right? We do our best to keep whatever we can local while understanding that there will be certain we need to learn things from some of our partners. We need to learn things from some of the people who are further ahead in the AI space. But at the same time, right, while we are learning, it is important to retain that knowledge and to further it for our own use cases, for our own needs, right? So in the short term, yes, maybe you're shifting where some of those dependencies sit. But if you are investing in capability building, if you're investing in building up infrastructure, and again, you don't have to immediately start by having like resourcing on the grand order of like thousands of GPUs or like hundreds of very talented people, right, so to speak. You can start to slowly build it up. And certainly using open source models is a way to kickstart, right, that kind of investment. Because what you can do with open source models, especially with more resource efficient ones like Sea Lion, is that you'd be able to host them with even just a few GPUs, or maybe even one or two GPUs, depending on the quality of the chip. And then you also be able to use much less resource to continue doing the training that you need to do. And you can use that as a platform to build up everything that comes around the model, right? Your infrastructure, your data, your evaluations, the capabilities and the talent needed to build and maintain all of that. Yep.
Right. Thank you. This may be a sort of simple question or a naive question, but where then do you see AI sovereignty actually residing in practice?
So this is actually a very multifaceted definition, right? Sovereignty. Um, of course, we at least okay. I'll speak from the perspective of the developers of Sea Lion, right? For us, while it would be ideal to have a model that we pre-train from scratch, like what we did with our first version, we very quickly realized that it's not really possible to be able to scale up our model sizes and the capabilities because there's just not that much data to go around. So from version 2 and onwards, we adopted a different tack, which is to build on top of models that we find are pretty good for Southeast Asian languages, such as Gemma, Llama, right? Auckland. And using those models, we did continue pre-training and we did post-training. And this allowed us to be able to bring out those capabilities even further for the C region, right? So all of this is a learning process. And by building these models, by being able to learn how to curate, create, pre-process the data for these models, by learning how to do all the fine-tuning for these models, how to do all the evaluations for these models, we are building up our capabilities. And in doing so, uh, we think that is actually one key part of what would contribute to sovereignty in AI, right?
Right. Thank you very much. And now, before turning to you, Dr. Said, a quick sort of clarification for the audience. I'm very sort of new to the AI game, so I'm also learning about some of these terms. But if I could just note digital public infrastructure and digital public goods. So these concepts refer to interoperable open systems that enable innovation while retaining public oversight. Many countries now look to them as benchmarks for bottom of the pyramid market entry in the AI era. So, Dr. Sayed, from Bangladesh's perspective, so how far can DPI and DPG, so digital public infrastructure and digital public goods, how far can those approaches realistically be extended into the AI domain? Where do they help governments build public interest capability? And where do limits begin to appear?
Thank you, Alejandro. And I must disagree with something that you said. You are not new to the AI dialectic. The way that I have seen to it, I have studied your papers, particularly the Manila Dialogue, and also the 6-volume series that you had last year, 2024. Fascinating, simply fascinating. And I was just going through 20 pages of speaking notes for tonight. And I was just thinking, actually, where does the sovereignty lies? Is it food? I'm from the bottom of pyramid, base of pyramid markets. So what are my compulsions? My compulsions, first of all, I need to feed my people, food, housing, shelter, medicine, medication, access to these 5 essentials, and plus one internet. Without internet, we go crazy. And of course, it's needed for livelihoods as well. Somewhere in between, particularly countries in the South, the base of pyramid markets, bottom of pyramid markets, we are endowed, blessed with institutional voids. We have inchoate demands. We know that we want something, but we cannot articulate that. In that kind of a situation, when we are faced with, facing the daily grind, we are faced with a foundational paradigm shift in tech, something which can redefine life itself, conceive life itself. So the question that you had, DPIs and DPGs, the way that we see to it, particularly, you'll find many of my papers on the bottom of pyramid, base of pyramid approaches towards artificial intelligence, the authentic AI protocols. I think personally, it's absolutely a personal observation. The sovereignty lies somewhere in the compute domain. It's not the choice of models. It's the choice of residing in that model, the opportunity cost of not choosing that model, the exit barriers. Entry is more often than not, it's easy. Exit is difficult. If you look at Bangladesh, I was just listening very carefully to what Chinkang was speaking about just a couple of minutes before, that they didn't have data. Look at me. We have the third largest, literally, the third largest attestation center. Every paper that goes out of Bangladesh anywhere goes through us. 12 million pieces every year. Imagine the depth and the breadth and the simple audacity of data. So we have huge data, huge. Do we know what we have? Unfortunately, we don't. And that's the major problem. And that problem doesn't come from the models. We have all sorts of models deployed. What we don't have is compute. We're barred by the compute wall. So I see the way that I personally would like to approach this DPI, DPG conundrum. DPGs could be digital public goods, goods as in goods and services, or the epistemology of goods, public goods. Is it DPI, the digital public infrastructure, particularly the way that India has done it? maybe Russians, the Chinese, and of course the US. Everyone has probably done some sort of DPGs, DPIs. How do we approach that? We approach that with modeling ourselves, the existing paradigms, into this augmented domain. And we are here basically somewhere where we don't know where we are going in next 1 year's time. 2024 November and 2026 January are vastly different from GPT Model 3 to GPT-5, and Grok came up in between and all sorts of the public domain usage. If you look at these LLMs, the large language models, the computes are fascinating, phenomenal. How much it includes the individuals from the BOP markets is a question, is a terrible question to be answered. We don't have an answer. It depends on the design. So if I'd like to sum it up, what I have said, sovereignty lies in somewhere between the choice for design, how you choose to design, and then of course implement and everything in the AI domain, and the actual computational power and the capability. If you don't have compute, all your papers are on paper only. You'll find many of my papers on the internet, but unfortunately, those are papers only. I don't have compute, and that's a fact. So I think this is where we are stuck. But it's this question, this answer is only it's time bound. It will be valid for 1 year only. 2027, we don't yet know what the models would bring. So this year, 2026 would be the inflection year. 2026, 27, 28. These 36 months to 48 months would define almost everything that we know about, particularly in terms of AI. Technocene, tech transcendence, many things would be coming up. But probably we'll discuss this a little bit later.
So Dr. Said, if I might, so where do dependencies then possibly re-enter during deployment, right? Where might you see some challenges with that regard?
Well, dependencies can come from, if I just have a look at it, from two different sources, exogenous and of course inside. So these dependencies could come from, as I have said, that you're bound to the compute power. If you don't have national compute, if there is one, you're bounded. Your rationality is also bounded because you cannot go beyond a certain limit. That's infrastructure. But the dependencies are often, the way that I have seen to it, is reintroduced because the guardrails are often, again, I'm not saying that it's the general case, often introduced by actors, agents, players beyond our sovereign reach. And this sovereignty, see, when I'm very pragmatic as a person, sovereignty to me is no more bounded to the territorial sovereignty that we had for last at least 100 years, the post-Westphalian state systems. So literally, this sovereignty is also evolving. What is sovereign in the digital domain? Although it's temporal, although it has traceability, still then, what is considered to be sovereign in a domain which is absolutely based on sort of a digital life form? Can electric sheep dream, digital dreams? That kind of a situation. So what is sovereign? That definition itself. So there are two areas in which this sovereignty issues, dependencies come in. Of course, there is a compute thing. And then there is this epistemology of AI, the way that it is evolving. It is yet to take full birth. And the ontology of AI, how you see AI. As Director General in the Minister of Foreign Affairs and also the Chief Innovation Officer, one thing I face every day, can you buy AI? No, you cannot buy AI. I'm sorry to say, you can buy compute, but you cannot buy AI. You have to build AI. And if you don't build AI, you have to absorb AI from somewhere, if at all. So this procurement, this traditional procurement concept is something which I'm facing. So these dependencies are coming both from the appreciation of AI, what AI is, what sovereignty is, where the boundaries are, and where the dependencies could be. So these questions, and also the epistemology of it, the model of it, started with tree of thoughts, chain of thoughts, graph of thoughts. Now we have society of thoughts. There will be more. And when you introduce quantum computing, the problem becomes multiplexed. Fractal algebras, fractal geometry. So many things come together. And I believe that one-way communication doesn't really work anymore. There are many ways communication, multi-temporal, multi-spatial, all in the same time domain at the dot. So it's a complex question, but I believe both epistemological and ontological.
Thank you very much. If I might turn to you, Akshay Mathur, building on what we've heard so far, Dr. Sayed referred to India, so perhaps you can talk a bit about the Indian perspective. How should policymakers think about open source AI as a tool for sovereignty rather than dependence, particularly as India prepares to host the AI Impact Summit? Where has the DPI DPG experience translated well to AI, and where does the analogy begin to break down?
Maybe let me. It's a very pertinent question. So maybe let me try and address it in a few different ways. First of all, I think I'm not sure if here at least the discourse really is talking too much about the challenges with open source AI. I think it seems like from conceptually at least, that is something that we have accepted. It's the best approach that we have to move forward. I think that's the general sense of the House. Does it raise issues related to concentration risk or market dominance risk, technology dependence, all the things that you said? Surely, at different levels. Off-the-shelf models or proprietary models, if we are going to take it on blindly, certainly will lead to some kind of dependency. Certainly, if we're not able to study the code, or if we're not able to build on the code or test it on our data. I think the AI governance models, the AI governance guidelines, which have been released by the government of India, are quite indicative. In fact, if you really read through it carefully, it speaks about sovereign AI, but it does not demonstrate any kind of anxiety or any kind of fear about technological dependence or market risks. Not yet. It does articulate that national security is a concern. It does, of course, the entire guideline. There's many recommendations there on how to build sovereign capability across the different sectors. So if the conversation actually shifts to what are the capabilities we need in different sectors, then of course you start looking at data, infrastructure. I think deployment is something you mentioned, the governance framework, and so on. I think you mentioned that is it possible for, is there a gap or is there susceptibility towards control, dependence, or leverage? I think those were your words. And across compute models, deployment, and so on. So the short answer is, I think so. This is, I think, what you're calling stack of sovereignty. As far as we're concerned here, I think there's been so much focus on building domestic capability on infrastructure. Of course, again, if you look at it compared to US and China, it doesn't seem like it matches. But beyond those two countries, putting 38, 40,000 GPUs to work and so on seems to be building some kind of sovereign capability. Same goes with models. Same goes with the kind of governance frameworks that we need. I do think that I know that AI and the risks that you're talking about brings with it a whole different kind of risk. But I want to mention like the case study of TikTok, because TikTok in India was banned a few years ago because of supposed risks to national security, right? And I think therein lies a couple of lessons, of how the government actually thinks about national security, and whether there is going to be any lesson for what, for us as we take on, let's just say, foreign software models and so on for our own use. Now, at that time, TikTok was banned. But I think the deeper question lies is not about the decision, but whether we're thinking of algorithmic accountability differently. Are we thinking about, um, uh, what we can potentially do with open source AI and what kind of protection we can add on the models that we seek? So, for instance, let me give you one example. Like the techno-legal solutions has become a really, really big area for us to look into as a possible way to ensure some kind of governance mechanisms for AI. It's part of the India AI governance framework. It is part of the India AI Impact Summit that's going to take place. It is one of those things in which a lot of scholars and experts are focused on how to introduce techno-legal solutions for governance. We've done some papers also at our institute. So I think that for us, techno-legal solutions becomes a really important part of governance. But let me just end on the question of DPI that you mentioned. That uh, DPI itself is, of course, it. I don't think we're calling it. So DPI may or may not be open source in that sense, but it certainly it depends on, because digital public infrastructure is actually now a category, and it depends on how it is used, for which application it is used for. Uh, if it's an application that requires privacy and you need to protect the code and you do not want to expose that, then it may not be, the application that developed may not actually reveal their source code. But on the other hand, there are use cases on which the entire framework is not only being not only exposed, but we're also sharing it with other countries. And actually, use of AI in DPI to make DPIs more effective is one of our future goals. That's really where, that's the heart of, at least from India's perspective, it's the heart of our next, is the heart of our effort. How do we make sure that we can use and build the next generation of DPI with the support or the technological advances that we have in AI? So I'm sorry, I feel like I do not. I felt like I was trying to string together a set of disparate thoughts, but I didn't know how else to really make sense of or address your question. So I hope that was useful just to begin with.
No, thank you very much. Maybe my question's a little bit all over the place, but actually, I'm wondering if, just reflecting on what Isabella talked about, when she mentioned these four pathways: specialization, alignment, pooling, and hedging. Now, I'm wondering about alignment, right? Is technological non-alignment viable?
I saw that go by really quickly in her presentations. I'm not sure exactly what that means as per the paper that she was presenting, but if it means that, developing, I mean, I suppose I think what it means is that it's a mirror image of sovereign AI, right? Which is that you're really depending on your own competencies, right? On your own capabilities across the ecosystem, across the supply chain, infrastructure, data, cloud infrastructure, GPUs, models, and so on. So I think
Actually, I can interrupt here. Align simply means which superpower are you choosing? Are you choosing US technology or Chinese technology or neither?
I don't. So as far as Indian government is concerned, the government has actually not indicated anything. But I think, as even if I were to speak on behalf of India here, I do not think that's a choice that is even being presented internally. I think that So uh, here's the realistic version. I mean, we're all our technology and everything right now is not from China. Actually, it is from, the Google has announced its data center here. I think most of the compute infrastructure is from NVIDIA. So, I think that's already indicative of an alignment. If you force me to actually give an alignment, but I think there's a difference between a tactical approach and our long-term strategy. So tactically, it makes sense. That is where the computational sophistication lies. I mean, there are countries and companies that are ahead of on India on these issues. So we should accept, adopt, build on what exists. But I think the long-term strategy is not only to build our own capability, or at least have a third alternative. as we have done in other fields with DPI, with our identity software and so on, with our e-commerce network. So at least to have a third or our own alternative. And then finally, to not maybe focus on the root of the software, but focus on diffusion. If we're really thinking that AI is electricity, is the analogy that is used, then maybe we should really be looking at maybe finding a way in which we can focus on diffusion rather than sovereign security risks that come by taking on a certain technology. I don't know. That's the best answer I have for you.
Thank you very much, Akshay. Alex, thank you so much for reminding me that we're talking about geopolitics as well, the title of the seminar. So, Alex, in fact, if I can come to you, sort of widening the lens slightly. So, as open source AI becomes more central then to national strategies, then how are you seeing it reshape geopolitical influence and alignment in practice? Where is influence actually being exercised through
Well,
models, compute standards, or governance frameworks? Yeah.
gosh, I mean that's a huge question. Listen, I think just commenting first on Akshay, like I think it is exciting that non-alignment might be possible in AI. I think it's right that taking the tactical in the short term, picking a side is not a bad idea, particularly given uncertainties around sort of AI trajectories, right? Like if there is some kind of if we are on the curve and we are going to see a really rapid acceleration in capabilities in AI, it does sort of make sense to attach yourself to one of the two front runners and count them. There are two. They are the US and they are China, and that same position is how my assumption as I'm hearing around Bangladesh and India as it is here in the UK. And the UK has made a very clear choice to align itself with the US and build on top of the US technology stack. So just so sure, that would be a sort of a starting point is kind of how we're approaching this, is that being really explicit that in terms of how you go about thinking about sovereignty, you ultimately have to make a decision between aligning with a superpower or trying to hedge between the two, or indeed trying a third way and building your own. And of course, India, but also Brazil, Estonia, Kenya, there are many examples of countries that have leapfrogged through technology and approaches to technology that really do constitute a third path that does not look anything like Chinese technology and does not look anything like US technology, which is why sometimes it can feel like you are stepping into the Stone Age when you go to the US and try to pay with your phone versus trying to do the same in India. To come to your point, open source, I think, is a really contentious area when it comes to AI. Clearly, it is a really viable and valuable at this stage path for countries to feel they have some kind of sovereign control. The idea is that you borrow a model, perhaps you then fine tune that model, and then you can build your products and services on top of that without necessarily having dependencies, at least to some extent. Obviously, there are legion dependencies on a US or a Chinese provider. If you look at the top, I think it's 8 when I last checked, open source models that are currently sitting on Hugging Face. They're all Chinese open source models. I think recently Europe came out with a pretty good one. We at Chatham House partnered with the Swiss government, ETH Zurich, in publishing a model. You can find out more at publicai.co. We call it a kind of inference utility that looks to try to kind of blend that DPI and an open source AI approach. But look, ultimately, the best open source models are coming out of China at the moment. And that has now an attention that has caught the attention of their rivals in the US. And so I guess to finish, it is obvious that open source AI models is proving an attractive option to middle powers looking to try to get in on AI without necessarily having the capital to deploy through either a thriving private sector or through enormous government spending. If you're looking to build on top of an open source AI model, you're probably building on top of a Chinese open source AI model. And that has now caught the attention of the US. And so recently, the White House has put out quite a lot of suggestions that US companies should now be releasing their own versions of AI models. And of course, you've got one from OpenAI. Meta sort of claims it has open source AI models as well. So that would be kind of my assessment of open source as it pertains to sort of sovereignty discussions.
Thank you. With regard to fragmentation, right, as a risk, so do you see this as mainly a risk in terms of governance, safety risk, or just a structural reality that people will have to work with or live with?
Yeah, great question. I can't really sort of say. I mean, there is clearly AI governance is in gridlock at the moment, and particularly sort of at an international level. If you look to sort of some of your previous champions of AI governance, maybe the European Union, there's a real sort of lack of appetite right now for putting any handbrake when it comes to growth, economic growth or innovation, a real sort of fear that they're already having been left behind by the US and China when it comes to AI, that now adding on a layer of regulation may slow things down further. Now, look, that is, I think, a very contestable position. And I think there are a lot of smart people who think that innovation and regulation can go hand in hand, and that Europe can create a market for trustworthy or safe AI that then can be, that it will then fill. But nevertheless, you have to sort of think about, if you think about the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks when it comes to, you just have to listen to President Trump at Davos or Mark Carney's speech. There is a clear sort of fragmentation in the international system where perhaps previously we would have looked for international governance of technology, leaving aside now the sort of growing rivalry and the accelerating race between the US and China when it comes to AI capability, or at the very least, the perception that there is this race that is being very much fostered by the White House. So absolutely, this is a function of fragmentation. The AI governance landscape is completely fragmented, on both in terms of capability and in terms of norms. Does that have anything to do with open source AI? I'm less sure.
Right. Now, I would ask the audience we're already getting some questions if you have any questions, please put them into the chat function or the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll get to the questions in a bit. I might just do a kind of brisk or more brisk round of the table and come back to you, Zhenggang. I'm wondering if you had any response to what the panel has said so far, and I have another question. Do you have any other comments?
Yeah. Just a quick one. So the question of alignment is very interesting, right? Now, when we're thinking about alignment at a governance level or at a policy making level, which is what we're discussing here, versus an alignment at a technological level, meaning like how do you align your model to be, maybe more aligned to your nation's norms, societal values, or what have you, right? And these are sometimes quite separate, right? The key here is how much of the model's behaviors can you actually influence, right? Whether through fine-tuning or even going more by doing a continued pre-training and so on. And that is why I started off by saying that we actually work with a large variety of models, because while some models are better for some tasks and others are better for other tasks, it remains true that as long as they are at least open weights, meaning you can download them and manipulate the weights yourself, you are able, to some extent at least, make the models more aligned to what you need them to be, right? So then that middle path or that third path actually is quite viable, right? Of course, questions of how much compute do you have, whether you have the capabilities to do, really draw the frontier capabilities, those still exist. But I think that third path is actually very viable. So that would be my response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. So get back a little bit to open source question. So what trade-offs do policymakers most often underestimate when pursuing open source AI strategies, do you think?
Yes, this is a great question. With open source comes a lot of responsibility and liability in terms of the data that goes into open source, right? So And this is something that has been discussed at length ever since ChatGPT came on the stage, right? If you're training on potentially private data, potentially copyrighted data, you actually can get to frontier capabilities a lot faster, right? With open source, you have to be a lot more responsible, right? So with open source, you're not able, for example, to use like maybe like non-commercial data or copyrighted data, obviously private data, right? So these things cannot be open source necessarily, and that is a huge challenge for policymakers, right? How do we use models that are still open, and how do we verify that the data that's gone into these models really is like that safe and secure, right? And also, if you're trying to train a model that is going to be based on open source data, how do you have that open source data still be high quality, still be competitive, right, so to speak, while not touching anything that is so-called not safe, not secure, or copyrighted, and so on, right? That is something that we, at least from our perspective, from our experience, is something that we still grapple with a lot. And we do see that there's a huge trade-off.
Right, thank you. If I might turn to you, and I apologize, I was saying Dr. Said, but I should say Dr. Muntasir. Dr. Muntasir, staying with the public sector lens, right? If a government deploys open source AI in areas like healthcare or public services, where do the questions of responsibility and legitimacy actually land when something goes wrong? Right? And if you did have any comments to what has been already said, I'd also welcome that if you.
Oh, in fact, a whole host of things. The way that I see to it, I hope you can hear me. So, in fact, I have three questions. I was listening to you and listening very carefully and taking questions. I'll tell my questions first.
Sure.
How can AI be democratized, even in an open source system, when the global GPU capacity is controlled by three companies? Data colonialization. Are open data sets extracting global south knowledge and then selling them to us as intelligence? The third question is exactly what you asked me. Where does the illusion of control lie? Where does it lie? Where is it? The way that I see to it, see, when something fails, see, first of all, AI is not an option. It's a must. It's not that if, it is going to be. Whether you deploy it, your adversaries deploy it, your competitors deploy it, your compatriots deploy it, someone has to do it and you'll be affected by it. There's no way out of it. I don't see it yet. You can choose to be out of it, of course. One can always live in Stone Age, but artificial intelligence is something which is going to come and touch anything and everything that you have somewhere. And probably the biological barriers will also break sometime soon. So the way that I would like to see is you need to probably assign responsibility to the algorithm, but that's not possible in the common parlance. So when a model fails, when a system fails, the state has failed. The way that we perceive state, Akshay might also compliment me here, the states in the South are like holy states. It's not like the West. It's not like the US. Here, states bear the responsibility and also the agency over people's lives in many cases. People hold the state system, not only political parties or governments, the whole state responsible, accountable, and probably to some extent guilty of all the ills that has happened to the people. And they might not be necessarily wrong. It could also be true because the way that state systems are effectively organized or not so effectively organized defines a lot to how the quality of life of the citizens of that state would be. Singapore is a beautiful example of that. But even in Singapore, Sea Lion, Moonshot, Lion Guard, I was just going through the models, and it was all constrained by data. And that is something where we have excess abundance of data, which is being utilized by some of the more famous companies in the world, corporates. See, I cannot even look into their black box models, but I can see some of the metadata. Llama 3, even for that matter, TikTok, is literally training on our data. 180 million people in Bangladesh. Mobile penetration is very high. Mobile penetration is very high. Internet penetration is also very high. So how much data are we generating? What are the layers we are generating? And how the protocols are shaping themselves up? That's why I have put in a question in the general chat box that is it compute sovereignty or is it cognitive sovereignty? So that itself, I see as a public servant, I see both of them being challenged, particularly from a resource constrained country. Maybe not so in India because they're investing heavily, but for a country like Bangladesh, of course, we have choices to make, choices between food and compute. I think food wins every time, fair and square.
Yeah,
So in terms of, yeah,
can I follow up then? Because from what you say, how does this affect the political willingness to deploy AI?
deeply, deeply. If the political leadership is aware, it will definitely invest in AI capability, compute models, frameworks, epistemologies, guardrails. I'd not call it governance per se, because governing AI is like, in the Indian subcontinent, we have the Mahout riding on top of an elephant. But even that is possible. But governing AI, well, you could tell it, you could request the AI to go in a certain direction, but definitely it will have its own alternatives. It's an optimization equation, almost always. There's no way out of it. So for a politician, he or she must be sufficiently aware of the risks, the responsibilities. See, the basic governance equation, autonomy, agency, franchise, authority, accountability, responsibility. These two sets of equations must be aligned with the decisions that a political authority makes. As a bureaucrat, the way that I see to it, I always try to identify these three parts of the governance equation, both of the governance equations to the decision maker, that these are the issues concerned. But the way that I see to it, see, someone has mentioned this very correctly, that there are hardly a few countries who are effectively discussing AI and other issues. And I have made a head count. 12 to 15 countries, as in the UN, are literally driving the AI dialectics and discourse. Hardly 12 to 15 countries. And maybe 7 of them are present on this screen. What happened to 194 countries? Definitely there are issues there, and there are discussions over there, and there are discourses over there as well, but they're not getting reflected in most of the documentations that we receive. WSIS, WSIS plus 20 was there last month, and 4 governance mechanism, 4 UN processes are on the way. AI for Good, Pact for the Future, GDC, WSIS, high level plenary. These are on en route. So in next 6 to 7 months, there will be lots of discussion. How many countries as a country will participate in those discussions except for voting yes or no? I doubt. And that's a serious worry. Because for me, I see the discussions getting dominated by a very handful of individuals and countries, and the whole of the world is listening and thinking that, okay, this is where my good also lies. But you have not even seen what these are. In terms of the political awareness, I think for a political leader, for a political authority, not only as an individual, but also as an enterprise, also as an office, it's supremely important that that office identifies everything as it is. Call a spade, and not really shy away from asking the questions, reasoning by first principle, maximally truth seeking. And if you put in too many guardrails, it becomes a very good conversation partner, but doesn't show you what exactly it is. If you look at it, if you look at the outputs that we're having, say I told you that we have 4 different sets of documents at my hand. The one that I trust most is the one that I have taken notes of, either from your discussions or from somewhere else. But I'm not counting on the model outputs that I'm getting, because when I was listening to everyone, I could see that what my models had given me. I could see the exact line for line, word for word outputs, and this the models are already predicting. So this prediction used to come from pattern recognition earlier, 10 years before, 15 years before, when still now it is LLM, but we call them AI. we used to think about pattern recognition, pattern matching. So anyone who was good with maths was very good with AI. But I think these days now you have to be very good with poetry as well to understand what's happening, because someone, no matter how many guardrails are there. Look at the Europeans. Europeans changed their entire AI projection in exactly 3 months. I was counting their projection, the GDPR particularly, especially when we had written the books on political economy of blockchains in 2021. I had been tracing the European evolution, and last year, in 3 months, the Europeans changed their posture, positioning, everything straight up, wholesale change. It's not just adding a few more layers, but it's a change in approach. And I think very few institutions in the world are actually working sensibly, inclusively. So, for a political authority, again, coming back to your question, I think three I's are important. We just had a discussion last week, and I said this out loud in the public domain, that income, inclusivity, and identity. These three I's are very important when you make a decision about artificial intelligence. AI is coming. There's no ifs and buts. AI is coming. What happens to your income? What happens to your inclusivity? Last man or woman on the last mile, included or not included? And it's not only just an access to internet, it's also access to decision making, how the algorithms are working. And third, what happens to you? Who are you? Your identity. And these three questions are at the center of any decision that political authorities are making at this moment. But again, I told you, this answer is valid for 1 year only. 2027, you'll have an entirely new set of answers, if not
Right.
new questions.
Thank you. If I might turn to you, Akshay, there's so much that's already been said. If you have any sort of reactions, particularly Dr. Muntasir had brought up some questions. Do you have anything to comment, reply?
No, I just on the chat box I saw that somebody talk about an early mover advantage when it comes to setting the rules, and I think I missed referring to that, but I do feel like I do agree that that is, I think, going to be one of our biggest uh, challenges as we. Or I wouldn't say challenge, but at least that's going to be something on India's radar as we move forward. Um,
Right.
So it's a very multidimensional issue. I don't know across which, because the rules and regulations that are going to be that may take shape now. Uh, we'll have to see across which domain we're talking about, whether it's infrastructure, are we talking about chips, are we talking about the applications, and so on. And then the question is that do we really find something problematic with those regulations? I mean, um, as far as India goes, it is not always necessarily opposed global regulation. So we have been a rule taker as opposed to being a rule maker for a good part of the global rule making system. But we've also supported a lot of global rules as they have developed, even if they've emerged from the West. So I'm not exactly sure if, or at least I don't know yet on which particular specific rule that we would challenge. I think that remains to be. I think that remains to be seen a little bit. But I do think that that's something that's on everybody's radar. And our own local laws do not yet talk about sovereign AI when it comes to data or digital protection and so on. So we're a little bit far off from global rulemaking.
Can I ask you to look ahead to the Impact Summit to Delhi? So which debates around open source AI do you think are most likely to be misunderstood or oversimplified at the summit, or just your sense right now?
Um, I think, Alejandro, that's not the way the AI Impact Summit discussions are being framed. The discussions are being framed across, say, how do we make it people centric, right? Now,
Okay.
now that's a that's a euphemism for saying how do we make deployment easier? How do we make diffuse? How do we make it easier for AI technologies to get diffused? How do we ensure that capital invested is not only going from B to B, but is actually going to, solve issues for the larger public, and so on. So I think that at least I have not seen such a specific discussion point yet. I do think that India is going to try and take a lead on some issues that are more pertinent for the global South. Uh, but I don't think it's necessarily about, whether specifically about, I think you said the challenges with open source AI, right? I don't know
Yes.
if I've seen anything specific to that. No.
Right. So, what would success from the summit look like in practical terms and from your perspective?
I think there is after the UK, Korea, and so on. I think what we're really looking from this summit is India's perspective and other global South on what they think are important guiding principles for global AI governance. I don't think that picture is clear yet, because the last few summits have shown possibly what the importance of AI was, and they were smaller summits. This is slightly bigger. And we have since in the last 1 year alone seen many different countries. I think this is probably what Chatham House was referring to. Many countries have actually released different national guidelines, right? And so I think a clear picture has not really emerged on, at least not really emerged on what the developing countries or global South is really thinking on AI, on global AI guidelines, which is why I think my previous response, I think, to the participant who raised the question, I think that's the idea for this AI Impact Summit. What do we do with countries beyond just US and China? What does the world look like? How do we build that infrastructure? How do we build that energy? We've not spoken about energy requirements in this discussion today, but what do we do about the energy requirements in this really, really tough global energy, situation that we have on our hands? So I think it looks like, and how do we build those applications? And if we build those applications, can they truly be digital public infrastructure, which can be used without any anxiety? I think those are the questions that I hope will be answered.
Right. Thank you. Alex, do you have any sort of response or comments to
Well, the
what's been
bar is the bar for success for the summit, I think, is quite low by comparison to France. And obviously, we've seen quite a change in these summits, right? From Bletchley, that was incredibly narrow and focused primarily on AI safety. Then it was, Korea, where it started to be watered down. Then we had France, which was basically a trade show, much less focused on AI governance or safety, much more focused on growth and implementation of AI. And now we come to Delhi. We come to India, and I think there's an open question here: is to exactly what this will be used for. I think that there is France, I think, is a pretty poor model. I think there were some positive outcomes, particularly in terms of the gathering of philanthropic support around various ideas around public AI. There was a lot of funding that was announced, a lot of investment in European AI infrastructure that was announced at the French summit. But none of that is AI governance, and the agreements, obviously, that surfaced in Paris were not signed by the UK or the US. So where you did get a piece of paper, whatever you consider it be its value, that was signed by the US and China in Bletchley Park, that was not the case in France. So the question will be, what do we expect from Delhi? And I'm also curious to see what is front of mind, and I do think that this is a real opportunity. I think India clearly does want to position itself as a country that is able to surface the considerations of the global majority when it comes to this technology, and they will be affected in very different ways. I think the gap between countries from the global south or from the global majority and countries like, I don't know, France or the UK, traditional kind of OECD economies, I think is actually much smaller than they would like. When it comes to AI, it is the gap between everybody else and the two superpowers that is the one to watch. And so as a result, I would hope that Western countries, who of course will be participating in the summit, I think our AI minister, Kanishka Narayan, will be joining, as well as I think also the Deputy Prime Minister. So they'll be joining at a very senior level with precisely that ambition to understand, what are the views of the global majority and how closely do they reflect those concerns that are closer to home.
Thank you. Can I ask you a bit more about sovereignty? So many governments speak of AI sovereignty while knowing they cannot control the full stack. So where do you see the most credible points of intervention for states in practice, given those constraints, right?
I think to some extent it depends on what the country has available, right? If you are Canada or if you're in the Nordics, perhaps you have energy as your sort of point of strategic leverage, right? You have abundant access to green energy, which allows you to build AI infrastructure, and that is your bargaining chip when it comes to negotiating with superpowers over the sort of shape of AI within, within the AI stack that you depend on. You may have, if you're very lucky, a unique technological capacity. Obviously, everybody knows of Taiwan as the center of the world when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing, but of course, Holland as the home of the lithography machines that sort of support the creation of semiconductor materials. That itself gives the Netherlands a degree of leverage in it. So you perhaps have some niche specialist capability. Perhaps you have a really deep set of capital markets. Perhaps you have something else. We talked about energy when it comes to the Middle East. That was clearly a key driver there. So for us, it's about strategic leverage, and I think that's really important. I think if you look at some of the language that has come out of the White House over the past month or so, notably the Pax Silica, which is a non-binding agreement between a number of countries, but led by the US. But also, if you look at the US's national security strategy, you'll see very clearly that it's a move away from thinking about a relationship with its allies and the rest of the world, a move away from the world as governed by rules or governed by a set of shared norms or values, but much closer towards a much more transactional relationship. When it comes to and Pax Silica, which is the sort of semiconductor agreement that they are leading, makes that super, super clear. And the question then falls to middle powers. And it's an uncomfortable question, is well, how are you going to hold up your end of the bargain? Because we have the compute, we have the cloud infrastructure, we have the frontier models. If you want access to them, well, previously that might have been because you are our allies, or we're just friends, or there is the special relationship, or however you want to think about it. Now, if it's more transactional, then you've got to have something to put on the table. And I think that is the question that is leaving a lot of middle powers scratching their heads right now.
And just to add one thing, Alejandro, I think just one thing before we move on. I don't know if this is the tone of the discussion, but I don't want to make it seem like, at least not on my part, that there's no hope beyond US and China, right? I mean, if you're truly, really thinking of AI and everything that it brings as eventually becoming like a utility, then we really also have some hope from the applications that we develop from it. And I think that there is some opportunity there, for countries beyond US and China to take some advantage of that and be able to build really pertinent, good applications. You started by asking me questions about DPI. You never asked me which database digital public infrastructure is using. You didn't ask me which compute facility it is using, because the application of digital public infrastructure itself has become so much more important than the underlying utility. So I think no doubt that the computing power is important. And that the chips are important and the models. But I do think that there is some hope to be gained from the applications that are going to be developed.
Great.
I would agree with that, and I think it is specifically India and to some extent Brazil and others who I hold the most hope for in guiding us towards that third way.
Wonderful.
I think I'll chip in here because
yes, please.
There's a whole host of design element in AI still left. Akshay has raised a brilliant point that there is hope, of course, still hope. I mean, it's not that it's like endemic, but it is hope. There is hope. And the hope comes from the design efficiencies, the design ingenuities. So if there is design, if there is good design, and see, the deep learning, the way that RLHF or any other mechanism works, it actually plays. It's a state of play. So when the play is there, there is hope. And there are many possibilities which are not yet known. That's why I say that don't stop the discussion. Let the dialectic evolve. We are just at the nascent beginning of what AI might look like. Still, we don't know exactly what it looks like. Whether it would copy us, whether it would be a different life form of its own, who knows? So there is hope. And essentially, there one other thing which becomes important, which has probably not been raised by anyone here yet, cyber sentinels. Security would not be anymore antivirus. So there's going to be different forms of breaches, and there's going to be different forms of, I would not say adversarial entries only, but there's also the differences in time and space, which would be important for how you approach cybersecurity, cyber sentinels, and the deployment of it.
Right. Thank you. Jiangang, did you have something to add on all of that before I go to the questions?
Yeah, thank you for bringing this back. I also agree that there is a lot of hope, actually. So coming back to what I was saying about being able to actually um, you know, shift the way the models ultimately behave based on if you have your own capabilities, or if you're able to work with other people, and this is the important part, right? If you're able to work with other partners in the region or other countries in the region, you have a shared goal, it then becomes a lot more possible to pool resources, right? Um, Maybe this is a bit naive on my part, but I don't think that compute resource is necessarily as binary as you either have it or you don't, right? Countries can work together, and organizations can work together as well. So there is actually a lot of opportunity to share resources, to work together. Country X has this, country Y has something else. We can work together, right? Just as Dr. Montasir mentioned just now, right? Like, Bangladesh has a lot of data. Maybe someone else really needs that data. How do we work together to do something beneficial for both, right? That is actually one of the central tenets of what we do here. So with our model, really, we want to use it as a platform for people to come together and collaborate, because we know that actually, at least not just our region, right? Many parts of the world is very resource poor compared to the US, compared to China. But if we work together, we can start to catch up.
Great. Now, I have some questions from the audience, and I'm sorry, getting to it a little later than I anticipated. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read these questions out, and then we'll do a round of the panel you can pick how you want to react to the questions. But I'll read them out. In previous technology cycles, governance frameworks often followed the interests of early movers. What lessons from past geopolitical or technological regimes can help avoid a similar concentration of power as new open ecosystems reshape global capability and influence? That's question one. Another question, from an India-Asia perspective, how can open source ecosystems support strategic autonomy rather than create long-term dependence on externally controlled infrastructure and standards? And a third question, open source models seem to have gained much global popularity because they are cheaper and easily set up. What steps could the US take to counter this challenge from open source AI systems? So, maybe I'll read a fourth question. Sorry to burden you with too many questions, but a fourth one. We focus heavily on open source software as a democratizing force. But if the compute required to fine-tune or run these sovereign models remains concentrated in a few nations or restricted by export controls, is open source actually accessible? In the panel's view, let me just get down, should sovereignty conversations focus less on model weights and more on compute governance and access to hardware for the global south? So let me do the round. You got these questions. You can comment on one or the other or all four or however you wish. Jiangang?
Let me take a look. So I think I'll take a shot at question 3, right? Regarding I guess in a way this is the opposite of what we've just been talking about, right? Essentially the question the way that I see it is about there is an open source movement. It seems to be growing in popularity. Essentially, maybe not just the US, but any I guess like large corporation that has enough interest in wanting to keep their models closed, keep all the data closed to increase dependencies on their infrastructure, their data, their models, right? What would an organization or a country like that do? Very straightforwardly, it will be very easy to try and lobby for, basically trying to copyright more things or trying to say that like more and more data is private. This is something that is already happening, right? So it's not anything new. And also, it is very possible if you already have like a SOTA model or frontier model on hand, it is very possible to try and sell that to more people by saying that, look, it's very simple. You don't need a lot of compute. You just need to pay for an API. Don't worry, your data is secure. You can just use my API. You can do many, many things with this frontier model, right? And the buy-in is quite strong, right? For these types of proposals. Now, the problem is dependencies again, right? So while it is a very good cheap solution in the short term, right? At the end of the day, that really doesn't help anyone in the long run. Without open source, it then becomes very difficult for researchers, for governments, for policymakers to understand actually what the technology is doing anymore. And if you can't really understand the technology, you can't build up the capabilities, you can't actually do your policy making anymore, right? So all of this ends up being, extremely disadvantageous. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Dr. Montasier, you can tackle the questions or any particular question or make another additional comments.
I have a whole set of answers to each of these questions. I was just thinking that which one I should answer and which one I should not, for the risk of losing my job tomorrow. So other than that, see the first one, the previous technology cycles. I think this time
Keep it brief,
artificial.
interest
I'll
of
be
time.
very brief. Yes, I'll be very brief. Previous technology cycles, AI is unlike any other previous technology cycle. Of course, it has the technology S-curve, the S-curve of innovation and others, and of course, market plateauing and things like that. But I don't think AI is, we are yet to actually conceptualize what the extent, breadth, and depth of AI would be. So it's foundational, it's paradigmatic. So previous technology cycles, we have nothing like that. But of course, AI, unlike or very much like previous technology cycles, AI is also a very potent weapon. Those who can weaponize AI would gain a lot from it. Now the question is whether an individual would do that, whether a corporate would do that, whether a country would do that, whether a group of countries would be doing that, or whether a group of individuals would be how the question of calculation of networks would be important. So new open ecosystems reshape global capability and influence? Definitely. Definitely. It would most definitely redefine the global capability frontier. Competence, adjacency, capability, everything will be redefined. From an India-Asia perspective, put Bangladesh inside that. How can open source ecosystems support strategic autonomy rather than create long-term dependence? Very difficult. Very difficult. Unless you have regular compute, unless you have service capability for that compute, even if you have open source data. See, I have an open source archive, digital archive, hosted on a tier 4 data center. Can you service that? I mean, if I have to do that, then I have already failed, and I have to do that myself. So although it's open source, but it's infeasible for me to actually host it here anymore. So it's better to actually buy in, easier. I'm not saying better, but easier. And usually I say that between food and compute, food wins. Third, open source models seem to have gained much global popularity. They're cheaper. What can US do? US can do a lot of things. US can make life easier. US can make life difficult. The question is what the rest of us would like to do. I think in the rest of the world, uh, individual countries have to take very strong, responsible decisions. The question of individual human responsibility comes to the front. Still, it is human-driven world, I hope. Still not bot-driven. So before that happens, leadership, the global leadership must act faster, sooner than later. And a lot will depend on what the quality of leadership that we have in different countries. And the last one, open source software as democratizing force. It is some sort of democracy, of course, but it's also data capture. So the way that open source softwares are going around, and also OS operating systems, kernels are building. So the kernels that we used to work on 20, 30 years before, I think I can still find some of the books that I used to have 30 years before. Those have changed, right? So the way that we used to write, that itself has also changed. So the compute itself is not the only factor defining here. It's also our approach to it, how we interact with it. So the dependencies which are getting created, which are being created with open source models, if we are only users and not designers, these are quite deadly. And until and unless you have your own designs, own platforms, own OS, own things, you're still dependent on to some extent that whether or not you will get access to it. I'll stop with just one example. I keep on using proprietary models, and it has happened a couple of times that when I had asked for certain compute, it stopped responding. And when it stopped responding, it was not a technical glitch. I can see it from here that this is not a technical glitch, that it has reached boundary conditions, boundary limits, guardrails. No, people interfered. So there is human interference. Maybe it was flagged by bots or something like that, but still there is human interference in the area. Since it's open source, there are many backdoor entries as well. Although it's secure, better than many others, but still there are ways to control, manipulate, and maneuver. I'd not say manipulate, but maneuver. So it depends a lot on what your ingenuity is, your security teams are, what the whole full stack of it. Stack on top of compute. Without compute, nothing exists. And below compute, as someone has said, energy, electricity, access, protocols, hosting it. For last couple of years, I have been trying to get an AI chip. Still not possible. I think it has come closest to us 600 kilometers down north, but still not getting any access. So that's a major problem for me. And not only me, many others like me. 80% of the world has this problem.
Rookie error. I forgot to unmute. Right. Just to advise the control room that since we started slightly late, that we'll just go over time just slightly. Akshay, your responses, or you already talked about one of the questions, I think.
Yeah, I think I've already addressed it. And on my comment, because I feel compelled to say it on the strategic autonomy and open source AI, is that I think the only real anxiety at this point, or at least what's articulated, is related to national security. Like for instance, AI-enabled disinformation campaign, or anything that causes public rioting or community violence and so on. So I think that's the real anxiety. And so, yes, of course, that only strengthens the case to know your code better. There, I don't want to go down the list of all the things that makes open source AI better, but I think for national security reasons, I think that's certainly a key consideration.
Right. And Alex.
Yeah, and listen, my reputation more turns on us finishing on time than it does on anything I have to say about AI, given Chatham House's long and storied history as a convener. So listen, Alejandro, thank you so much for the conversation. Nothing really more to add from me, just to say thank you to my panel, or to the panel for the great conversation, and also to AI Safety Asia for helping convene.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I might well be able to end on time. Sort of hard to multitask to summarize, but I think open source AI is neither guarantee of sovereignty nor a trap by default. Outcomes, I guess, depend on how it's embedded across the stack. Sovereignty in 2026 is maybe less about control, owning everything, and more about selective control, credible fallback options, and meaningful intervention points. DPI and DPG solution models matter, but they're not universal solutions, especially as compute standards and liability harden as constraints, and compute a kind of important aspect there. And importantly, many of the most practical governance insights are emerging from Asia and the global South, maybe not being imported from them, and we should have hope imported into them, and we should have some hope that indeed solutions and innovations can come from this region. So these are exactly the issues policymakers will, I think, need to confront in Delhi in a couple of weeks. So it remains for me to thank our panelists, our speakers, Jangang, Dr. Muntasir, Akshay, Alex, and to thank our Chatham House colleagues, my AI Safety Asia colleagues. So on behalf of both organizations, I thank you all for joining us. I thank the panelists again. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Hope to see you soon. And in Dhaka,
Yes.
every one of you.
Thank you all for the great discussion.
Thank
Bye.
you.
So thank you very much. I hope to see you soon, and I'll
Yes, I
share
hope
some
to
of
see you in
my
India.
papers with you. Okay? See you
Cheers.
then.
Bye.
Bye.